Hi everyone, welcome back to part 3. So this is the final part of session 1, I promise. So we're nearly at the end for today. So we're in the final part, we're going to bring all of this information together now on the vicious cycle of OCD. So just to recap, part 2 was to start to think about the obsessions on its own, the compulsions on its own, and this added element of avoidance as well. Just looking at different examples of OCD, different examples of obsessions, compulsions, and avoidance, starting to reflect on our own experiences. We're now going to bring that all together. OCD is like a vicious cycle. So compulsive behaviours link in with those obsessions to keep the OCD going. Avoidance also keeps OCD going. Concerns about intrusive thoughts keep OCD going. That value that we give the obsessions keeps the anxiety and keeps the OCD. The next slides show the general cycle that we would see with an OCD, and then we'll look at a few examples as well. So as we go along here, you might want to write down the different elements. I'll try and take it slowly to start off with, so that you can then start to think about your own. If you don't want to, again, that's absolutely fine. Just take it in at this stage if you want to. Again, you can always re-watch it if you need to. First of all, have a trigger or a situation that will lead to an intrusive thought, image, or urge. Now, that trigger might not always be clear, so I think that's a really important element to remind people of, is that we're not always going to know what that trigger is. We're not necessarily always going to know why it's come up. Sometimes we do, and I think more so with OCD, there is a trigger or a situation, a person that may bring up that intrusive thought, but it's not always clear to us. So we then have the intrusive thought, an image, or an urge. That then leads to us feeling that that thought, that obsession is important. I need to give that attention. There's an important meaning that I give to my intrusive thought. So remember, that's the important part between, or the important difference between people that generally have intrusive thoughts, or everyone that has intrusive thoughts, that experience OCD. So that's the meaning that we give to those intrusive thoughts. So have the trigger, that triggers an intrusive thought, an image, or an urge. That thought is seen to be important. I've given that meaning. Because it's important, but because it's unpleasant, it then triggers off unpleasant feelings or emotions. So that includes anxiety, shame, disgust. Because we have that unpleasant feeling, we then have an urge to stop the thought coming true. Well, if I have this thought, that means something bad's going to happen. That makes me feel anxious. I need to make sure that that's not going to come true. Remember that responsibility that I'm holding on myself to make sure that that thought doesn't happen. I then put in place behaviours or compulsions to stop the thoughts or the feelings. So I may do something to ensure me that the thought isn't going to come true. But also compulsions can be behaviours or mental activities to help reduce the unpleasant emotion and to reduce the anxiety. I then get temporary relief. When I'm doing that compulsion, I get temporary relief from the unpleasant feelings. If I'm checking, okay, I feel reassured that I have turned that off. And I repeatedly do that to reassure myself that the thought isn't going to come true, and therefore the anxiety reduces. So the more I do the behaviour, the more relief, the temporary relief I get. But I suppose the other element of this is that the more I learn that that compulsion is giving me some sort of relief, the more likely I am going to want to do it. Well, if I check, I've noticed that that really helps my anxiety reduce. So I'm going to do that again if that trigger, if that intrusive thought happens again. We're creatures of comfort. We're creatures of learning how to get positive emotions, how to get relief from things. Well, I know that that behaviour, that compulsion is going to help me feel better, and it's going to make, and I believe that if I do that compulsion, it means that that thought isn't going to come true. But in fact, what this compulsion does is stops me from finding out if the meaning that I have given to that thought, the belief I've given that thought is actually accurate or true. So yes, the compulsion does relieve my anxiety. And the more I do it, the more relief it gives, so I'm going to do it again. However, it also stops me from realizing actually that that thought might just not have had come true anyway without me doing the compulsion. And also the meaning of that thought, or the meaning that I've given that thought, is entirely accurate, or questioning whether it's entirely accurate. Add to this, I then look out for triggers. Because it was so unpleasant, that experience before, I'm now going to look out for those triggers that are more likely to cause that intrusive thought to happen. So I have a selective attention. It might be looking out for things in my body, for example, to make sure that I haven't caused harm to myself or others. Selective attention on cleanliness, things being on or off, selective attention on switches, that kind of thing. So I'm really attending to triggers now to try and reduce the chance of that intrusive thought happening and reducing the chance of those unpleasant feelings happening again. But what happens in this case is that I'm now putting even more value to that thought, because I really don't want it to happen. But also, actually, the more I look for it, the more likely I'm going to find it. If I'm really hyper aware of, I don't know, I suppose it's switches or things like that, I'm more likely to notice them and therefore more likely to trigger the intrusive thought. But it's something that we're currently doing because we really don't want that intrusive thought to happen. So initially what it does is add another element to keep the OCD going. Then we add avoidance. So I then avoid triggers. So I'm really aware of the triggers that are going to my intrusive thought, and then I avoid them. This also gives me temporary relief. Well, if I don't see people, then I don't get the anxiety, I don't trigger the intrusive thought, I'm safe. So the more the avoidance I do, the more I learn, actually that's bringing me temporary relief from this anxiety, so I'm going to do it again. What starts to happen for a lot of people with OCD is that we just start to not go out. We don't do things to ensure that we don't trigger our intrusive thoughts. And we do start to build a bit of a prison around ourselves for a lot of people. So avoiding triggers to try and then reduce the chance of that intrusive thought. The more that we avoid, the less likely we are to come to I suppose, or to face the fact that potentially these intrusive thoughts, because we're thinking them, doesn't necessarily mean that they are true or that they will happen. So the avoidance does bring short-term relief, but it keeps the anxiety going because we never learn that actually if I didn't avoid, well, then actually it still wouldn't have happened. And it's the meaning that I'm giving to these thoughts that are keeping the OCD going. I hope that's making sense so far. So let's look at a few examples. Sometimes it's helpful to go through examples of this. So we have a trigger. The intrusive thought that we have is images of germs on the hands. This thought is true and I'm going to become ill. So the appraisal, the value, the importance that we're putting on that thought is, well, I've had this image of germs being on my hands. It's definitely true. I'm going to become ill. So it's important. I'm then potentially looking for germs as well. But remember, the more that we have this intrusive thought, the more aware that we are, or so we have a selective attention to these triggers. Because I've had this thought, I then feel anxious and disgusted. Really unpleasant emotions. They're really, really strong. You know, these aren't little emotions that we feel. We can feel them physically, we feel them emotionally. So they really do bring up a lot for people and can lead us to feel very overwhelmed. So I want to get rid of these germs. I want to get rid of this anxiety, but I'm going to do that by getting rid of the germs. So I wash my hands for 30 minutes. That's my compulsion. If I wash my hands for 30 minutes, I can be sure that then the germs have gone. I'm not going to become ill. feel less anxious, less disgusted. The more I learn that, the more I learn that actually if I wash my hands for 30 minutes, I feel that anxiety reducing, the more likely I am to do it. And in future, if I avoid touching objects, I'm less likely to get germs on my hands, which means that I'm reducing the chance of that anxiety developing or that intrusive thought coming into my mind. So ultimately, the avoidance gives us a sense of control. The compulsion gives us a sense of control. What it does, especially I suppose in this example, for example, if we avoid touching objects, that becomes a very big amount of, or a very large amount of things that we need to avoid moving forward. So actually the avoidance becomes bigger, the compulsions potentially need to become longer, and it leads to then more triggers and keeping the anxiety going. So I learned that washing and avoiding touching objects helps me to feel better in the short term because it does bring relief. But what it does is I didn't, or what I suppose what it leads to is that I didn't become ill, which strengthens my belief that my thoughts are true, but that the compulsions and the avoidance are leading that to be true as well. So I don't question that original thought that because I had that thought, I'm going to become ill, because the compulsions and the avoidance were my way of gaining control and avoiding that from becoming. Rather than doing nothing and seeing that that thought still doesn't become true, I've developed compulsion and avoidance to ensure that that belief doesn't come true. So I'm reconfirming the belief. Well, I didn't become ill because I did the compulsion and the avoidance, not anything else. Intrusive thoughts of house on fire. So if this thought comes true, it will be all my fault if the house is on fire. So I feel anxious. I want to make sure my house is safe. So I check and recheck appliances for an hour. After that hour, I feel less anxious. I then avoid using appliances. So I've learned that checking and avoiding using the appliances helps me to feel better in the short term. My house didn't catch on fire because I checked so carefully. So that's the only reason the house didn't catch fire and it wasn't my fault, is because I checked carefully and I avoided using the appliances. I'm not questioning anything else. I'm not questioning the fact that that thought is just a thought. It's definitely going to come true. And I'm looking out for danger as well. We've got this selective attention. So now I'm looking out for danger, more likely to trigger the intrusive thought. It becomes more repeated. So I need to do the checking and rechecking more often and for longer, essentially. Intrusive image of stabbing a man in the street. So I might be just walking down the street. I have this image of stabbing someone. That goes against everything that most people value, that how they see themselves. So I'm a terrible person for having this thought. I am terrible. I feel ashamed with myself. I want to protect other people from myself because I really believe that that thought means that I'm terrible and that it's likely to come true. So I feel utterly ashamed. I want to protect other people from myself. So I'm going to look for reassurance online and from friends. So I'm going to seek reassurance from others, but also online to make sure that nothing terrible happened to anyone on the routes that I've just taken, for example. Because I've looked, I've reassured myself, I feel less ashamed now because I didn't do anything. I can confirm to myself I didn't do anything on that occasion. But in the long term, I avoid people. Well, actually, if I avoid people, I'm less likely to have that intrusive image, but I'm also less likely to cause anyone harm. So I've learned that seeking reassurance, avoiding people helps me to feel better in the short term. It reduces that chance of feeling ashamed and that thought happening. If I hadn't looked for reassurance, I'd have felt ashamed all day. So again, in this case, what we do is we learn that the compulsions and the avoidance is the only way of getting rid of that shame. I can't cope with that shame unless I put this compulsion into place and unless this avoidance is here. Otherwise, it's going to be there forever. I'm also looking out for people when I'm walking down the street, for example, to try and make sure that I don't hurt anyone. But actually, the more that we're vigilant for people, the more likely we are to trigger that intrusive thought. So I'm not questioning anymore that I'm a terrible person. It's a fact. There's no challenge to that. And I feel ashamed and I need to protect people from myself. keeping the cycle going. Another example is intrusive urge to line pens in an order. So some people just have a real urge for things to be in order, as we talked about before. So things have to be 100% perfect. They have to be. It's my responsibility. If they're not 100% perfect, I feel agitated. I want to feel less agitated. So let's make things 100% perfect. Let's line up pens in colour order, make them very straight, make sure they are exactly how I want them, 100% perfect. If I do that and I spend a number of minutes, hours on that, I feel less agitated. So I learn that that helps. I avoid using pens. So if I don't mess that order that's already there, then I avoid messing it up. It's therefore not likely to be not perfect. So I avoid using the pen. So I've learned that lining up my pens, avoiding using them, helps me to feel better in the short term. If I avoid using the pens, it leads to potentially other triggers as well, different things that we need in order to be 100% perfect, but also feeds back into that cycle. I then might look out for objects, look out for things that aren't 100% perfect, because I know that I don't want to feel that agitation again. So if I look out for it, then I can be totally aware of what's going on. But actually, the more that we look, the more hypervigilant we are, the more likely we are to trigger the intrusive urge, and then I'd feel agitated again. Next example, final example on this case, is intrusive images of naked child. So I should control my thoughts. I should control every thought that comes into my mind. I feel ashamed at myself. I want to get rid of them. So I do mental activities or thought. I try to push that thought out of my head. I try to push it to the back of my brain. And there might be different things that we do to try and do that. So different mental counting activities, or we might be keeping ourselves distracted. So the more I try to push that thought out of my head, the less ashamed I feel. I avoid being near children as well. But if I'm not near children, then I don't need, I'm less likely to trigger the intrusive thought, but also I'm going to definitely make sure that I don't cause anyone harm. I've therefore learned that pushing thoughts away and avoiding children helps me in the short term, helps me cope with that feeling of shame. If I hadn't tried to push those thoughts away, I'd have felt more and more ashamed. I wouldn't have been able to cope. So if I hadn't done that compulsion, if I hadn't avoided, I would have just kept feeling more and more ashamed. Nothing else would have stopped it. Also look out for inappropriate thoughts. So we've talked about how we can be hyper aware of people or things. Actually, it might be that we start to then tune even more so into our thoughts. We become even more aware of inappropriate thoughts that we have, become hypervigilant for every single one that comes into our minds, which is then causing more chance of triggering those intrusive images and sense of feeling ashamed. I hope that started to make sense. I hope that started to see how each of these different elements keep the anxiety and the OCD going. And in the short term, how compulsions and avoidance, yes, does relieve that unpleasant emotion, but it's only keeping it going because we're not challenging the thought, we're not challenging, or I suppose we're not seeing how able we are to cope with that feeling without those compulsions or avoidance. Okay. I'm just going to take a little bit of pause here. I suppose just to reflect on all of that is a lot to take in just to start off with. There's now one more element to add in, which is other. We know that now. We've got that cycle, we know what it is, and do go back if you need to. There's just an additional element to it where other people can also be in. So around 90% of people with OCD have friends or family members who help with their compulsive and avoidance behaviours, which is understandable. Friends and families want to help, they want to learn how they can help. And so if you're telling them what they need to do in order to reassure you or to support you, they're likely to do that because they love you and they want to support you and help you relieve that unpleasant emotion. But again, if they're helping you or involved within your compulsive behaviours and avoidance, it's in the short term that they're helping. This means that they are part of the maintenance cycle. So let's slow it down again. We have the trigger. We have the intrusive thought, the image, or the urge, and we see it as important, as an important meaning that I give to my intrusive thought. I'm looking out for triggers as well, which is feeding back in. That's a cycle within itself. I have that intrusive thought, I have unpleasant feelings, an urge to stop them from coming true. Other people try to stop the intrusive thoughts. So here's the difference. So it might be that we have a combination of compulsions and other people as well, just to say. We're thinking about other people, friends or family, try to help us to stop that intrusive thought. That, whatever that is that they're doing, gives us temporary relief. Other people also help us to avoid triggers, so they might do things for us to ensure we can stay at home, or do different things in order for us to avoid those triggers, which also brings temporary relief. So both of those elements, they're doing things to stop the intrusive thoughts, and they're also helping us to avoid, to try and bring relief from those unpleasant feelings. That feeds into that cycle. So other people helping out helps me to feel better in the short term. I learn that actually if I ask my friend to do that for me, I feel a lot better. Or if I ask that person to reassure me, I feel a lot better within myself. So I continue to do it. The more I do it, the better I feel. Okay, this is the way I cope. But it stops me finding out if these thoughts are true, and it stops me from being able to see that I can cope on my own, that I can cope with this unpleasant feeling, that I can challenge the real truth of this thought, or at least start to recognize whether, or question how accurate that thought is, and whether the thought actually needs as much value as I'm giving it. So I really want to make it clear here that we're not, this isn't intentional, those people aren't intentionally keeping your OCD going, they're wanting to support you. But other people, it's really important to also recognise for friends and family and for the individual that's experiencing the OCD, that they are also playing a part. Because also ultimately they're also going to then need to play a part in changing it or challenging it. So an example, intrusive thoughts of house on the fire, we just looked at this one. The addition of trying to avoid the anxiety is my partner checks appliances and reassures me. So we get other people involved in the checking. I avoid using appliances myself, so my partner does all the cooking, for example. I've then learnt that other people checking and avoiding using appliances helps me to feel better in the short term, and my house didn't catch on fire because my partner checked so carefully. Because my partner did it, and because my partner checked, that means that that thought won't come true. The house won't catch on fire, and it won't be my fault. I feel less anxious, keep the anxiety, the OCD cycle going, because each time I have that intrusive thought, I need to then get my partner to check and to do it for me, and therefore I feel better. But I'm always looking out for danger, which means that I'm more likely to trigger that intrusive thought, which means that I'm more likely to see my partner over and over again to check things. And the more I avoid using appliances myself, the more likely I am to be fearful of ever using appliances or triggering that intrusive thought. Intrusive image of naked children. I should control my thoughts. So my mum gives me reassurance. I feel less ashamed. My mum does all the shopping, so I don't need to leave home. I don't need to come into contact with children. So I've learned that seeking reassurance and avoiding leaving the home helps me to feel better. If my mum hadn't reassured me, I'd have felt more and more ashamed. So without that reassurance, I would have continued to feel ashamed. And potentially, if I hadn't gained that reassurance, the thought was more likely to become true. I'm also looking out for inappropriate thoughts. Remember that selective attention on those thoughts, which means that the triggers more likely to come up, the intrusive thoughts or images are more likely to be more frequent. And so we just continue to develop and trigger this cycle. The more my mum does all of the shopping for me, the less likely I am to challenge the fact that that thought is unlikely to be true, and actually that I'm never going to harm a child. And so the belief in that thought becomes even more. I suppose we increase that belief and that value in that thought because we don't challenge it to say to us, actually, that isn't going to happen. I can deal with that feeling of shame. Intrusive images of germs on hands. So I feel anxious and disgusted because I'm going to become ill because of the thoughts on my germs on my hands. I want to get rid of them, so I ask my son to clean the kitchen thoroughly. If he's cleaning the kitchen thoroughly, I have faith in him doing that. I feel less anxious and disgusted. I then ask my son to do all the washing and the cleaning because I have more faith in him being able to do that. Well, I'm having the intrusive thought of images of germs on my hands, so it means that I'm not doing something right. So it means that I'm more likely to become ill. So I'll seek reassurance from other people who I feel are more capable. I learn that my son cleaning and washing helps me to feel better, so I'm going to repeatedly ask him to keep doing it. This stops me finding out if my thoughts are true or important because, well, the only reason I didn't get ill is because my son cleaned the kitchen so thoroughly and because he did all the washing and cleaning. So I don't find out if my thought of me becoming ill is going to come true. I don't find out that if I just sit with that thought, whether I would have become ill or not. I also don't sit with the anxiety and the disgust, so I don't realise how capable I am to manage that on my own. And I also then start to look out for germs. So I start to become really focused, hypervigilant on the germs, any images in my head or anything that I see, and I then need to ask my son to do it again and again. And the more avoidance I play in that, or the more I ask other people to do things for me instead of doing it myself, the less confident I feel within myself, and the more likely I am to develop a wider range of triggers for my intrusive thoughts. That's a lot of information. I'm hoping it's starting to click in though. I'm hoping that it's helped to go through that many examples just to start to see all of the different elements that are coming in. I suppose what I really gained from looking at this and learning about this was how much or how many areas of the cycle there are for people that are experiencing OCD. It's the obsessions, it's the compulsions, it's the avoidance, it's other people. There's so many different parts of it. There's the importance that we give to that thought that is keeping the OCD going, that it's not surprising that we feel so overwhelmed, so out of control, and that we take part in these compulsions and avoidance to try and help us gain even an inch of control and try to reduce this anxiety even by a little bit. That's it. I'm finished. I'm done for this session. I want everyone to just take a breath because I appreciate there's a lot there and a lot of thought that needs to be taken in regards to how it plays out for you and your own experiences. Has brought up anxiety for you, I really encourage you to take some time once we've finished this video to just look after yourself, just to give yourself a break. Have a cup of tea, have a biscuit, do whatever you need to do to just relieve that anxiety and almost like giving yourself a bit of a debrief. So session summary today is workshop 1. We focused on what the symptoms of OCD are, what the different types of OCD are, and then how OCD is maintained. So we have really broken it down into the minute detail of each element of OCD and then how each of those elements keeps the cycle. Next time, we're going to look at what helps with OCD. So we've got this picture now, we've got this understanding of what's happening. We now need to then start to develop an understanding of what we're going to do in order to change it. So workshop 2 is really focused on what helps with OCD and what do we offer in the OCD clinic and within CBT to support trying to reverse it in a more helpful way. I hope you found that helpful. I hope it's got you to start thinking about your own experiences. Remember, you can rewind, you can rewatch, You can take notes, so please do feel free to do that. And then I'll look forward to seeing you in workshop 2. Take care, everyone.